I'm Anna Pakes, and I have been teaching at Roehampton for 7 years. My area of interest is philosophy in relation to dance, and that's something that I've been engaged with really since I did my PhD at Laban in the late 1990s. So I teach philosophy at third year level on the dance studies course on the BA, but also at MA level and supervise PhD students. And my research is centred around philosophical questions that one can ask about dance. Philosophy is important to dance because it asks big questions and general questions which touch on all sorts of assumptions and ideas that underlie what we do in dance. So, for example, my research at the moment is interested in what a dance work is. The question of what kind of thing that is, given that it doesn't seem to be something physical, like a painting or a sculpture, and given that it seems to be the sort of thing that can be physically manifest in a number of different performances. So there are questions about, well, are there limits to the identity of the dance work? Are there limits to its variability, to the way in which it can be interpreted in performance? Is there something distinctive about being a dance work as opposed to a work of theatre, say? Is the choreography or the way in which movement is structured and patterned essential to what the dance work is? Or are there other aspects or other constituents that are more important in some dance genres? So philosophy allows you to develop a reflection on those things. I think actually the questions are already raised in dance itself and in the way that we typically talk about dance. But I think that philosophy is valuable because it provides certain tools and strategies and a context within which to develop those ideas and push them further, push the reflection further and make it more systematic, and that's useful in developing our thinking. I think it's also valuable because it's an alternative approach to some of the others you find in dance studies. So it's not explicitly a political or ideological approach. It's not about the kinds of representation that happen through dance in terms of gender and race, for example, although it could touch on those things and could explore the basis for those sorts of meanings arising in dance. But it offers a different way of looking at dance, which asks different sorts of questions. Well, the obvious way in which it's shared is through writing. Philosophy tends to take the form of, tends to take a written form. So it's a philosophical reflection that you can follow through by reading the argument as it's written. But it does inform the way that I teach as well, quite profoundly, I think. So the ideas are shared by provoking others to ask questions, questions that we can unpack and explore together. And I think also that, well, hopefully there is the questions and the answers have a resonance within dance practice, so any conversation with practitioners has the potential to develop the philosophical reflection. And it's really a conversation that happens in two ways. It wouldn't be a question of me telling the practitioners what the philosophy says. It's more a question of what they tell me about what they do informs the way that the reflection happens. But hopefully there's also a movement in the other direction where the philosophy can help to open up things that perhaps haven't occurred to people before when they're working very closely with the practice. Well, I think a lot of the contemporary conceptual choreography does quite explicitly engage with those sorts of questions. Some of that work I find very interesting some other works perhaps are a little bit too laboured in the way that they develop philosophical thinking. But there are practitioners particularly people who've been working over a number of years, whose practice has a kind of depth which seems to me to be conducive to philosophical elaboration, or perhaps already doing philosophy in some sense. I'm thinking there of people like Rosemary Butcher, perhaps, whose work seemed to me to be quite profoundly metaphysical on many levels, although she wouldn't talk about them in those ways. Also, works like Rosemary Butcher's raise a lot of interesting questions about meaning, about how we construct interpretations, and about the relationship between ideas and movement. And again, I don't think she'd use that terminology to describe what she was doing, but nonetheless it seems to me to be something that's happening in the work itself. But in principle, any dance is there for philosophical reflection, or available to be reflected upon. In teaching I did last week, I was looking at Swan Lake, for example, and that raises very interesting problems of identity and authenticity. And it's quite interesting because it's a long time since I did ballet myself, but it's quite interesting to revisit classical works like that, but with through a slightly different lens. Well, I think there is a bit of a job to sell it in the abstract, if you like. I mean, I think that often at third year level, people sort of end up doing my module and they're not quite sure what it is. But then by 3 or 4 weeks in, hopefully, they're beginning to get into the mindset of philosophy of art and understand the sorts of questions that can be posed through that means. And then I think it starts to get interesting and it sucks people in. Because the questions are very, very important, and on one level they seem quite abstract, but on another level they seem absolutely fundamental. Things like, well, what is expression? You say that dance expresses. What does that really mean? Does that mean that my ideas, my feelings have to be transmitted in some way to you as the audience of my work? Or does it mean something else? And so it allows you a space in which to really think about those things that we tend to take for granted in the language that we use about dance, but also in the way that we choreograph and perform often. And I think people find that quite seductive in a sense, because it's not often that we have that space to reflect. And the module and philosophy teaching in the context of a dance programme has the potential to give people the room to look again at what they do. I think also, although the term philosophy can seem quite dry, there is a sort of sense in which it's also quite seductive. People are intrigued by it sometimes and want to probe further. It sounds quite clever, but it isn't any cleverer than any other subject, of course. It's just a particular mode of thinking and a willingness, I guess, to ask the sorts of questions that we tend to brush aside in everyday life, as in art practice.